So thank you all for joining us here today. We are really excited to be talking with you about some survey data that we gathered about a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago. And how this came about was we in the bike movement, we have for a long time craved better data for informing our work. And so, fortunately, the County of Santa Clara last year provided some funding for us, and we then partnered with the Mineta Transportation Institute to go out to the public and try to figure out how are people feeling about transportation? What are the attitudes that they have? Why do they make the decisions that they make when choosing their transportation mode? And to use that information to also understand things like bicycling. So we're really happy to be here today. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Fang very shortly here, and he's going to walk through some slides. But very quickly, we surveyed about 1,000 people using an organization called Change Research. Many of you have probably heard of them. They do a national polling mainly focused on politics. And they're helping to revolutionize polling and make it much more accessible. But we're really excited about this data. It's just a treasure trove of information about how people feel about transportation that we're able to slice and dice according to different demographics, age group, gender, ethnicity, geography. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kevin Fang.
All right. Well, thanks, Shiloh, and thanks everybody for joining us here today to talk about here our survey data here on Santa Clara County, as well as kind of gather our thoughts here on kind of what might happen here in the post-COVID future. As we can see here, we did this survey, as Shiloh mentioned, back last March, which of course was an interesting time in the world for everybody. And I mean, we sort of literally got this survey out here at the sort of last possible pre-COVID moment, as it was out there in the field from March 6th to March 11th. Before we kind of get into the data, what we found back a year ago, and then what we might think might change here, I did want to sort of you take a step back and sort of talk briefly here, sort of about sort of where we are in transportation. So people, of course, care a lot about things like traffic congestion, but I did also want to point out some of the many considerations we have when thinking about transportation and sort of the lens that we might sort of look at the data that we found here. And some of the the big things that are sort of affecting how people consider transportation today, in addition to things like traffic. Of course, we've got environmental issues. Here in California, more than half of our greenhouse gas emissions in the state are related to either transportation or industrial uses that oftentimes feed transportation, like oil and gas extraction or oil refining. Given those environmental impacts, we've got lots of goals in the state around reducing the amount of vehicle travel that people do. So kind of current regional targets for reducing driving are about 10%, which are fairly modest. I mean, we could set higher goals, but 10% is sort of where we are at now. And then some other issues we get here with sort of the amount of driving that goes on. Graph there on the right takes a look at traffic deaths as logged by the federal government in Santa Clara County throughout the 2010s. And there is sort of this pretty obvious upward trend there, which is a little bit concerning, in terms of those traffic safety numbers. So when we look at the data and we think about sort of some of these paradigms that we're in terms of wanting to look at reducing driving, one of the kind of themes that came up to me when looking at the data is there's some glass half full and some glass half empty kinds of signs that we get in the data. And so first off, which is probably not surprising given if you're just say walk out on many streets here in Silicon Valley, is that most people are relying heavily on cars for their daily travel. In our survey, 89% of respondents reported that they drive a car. in an average week. 71%, so we're super majority here, say that all or almost all of their daily transportation is by car. And then sort of in terms of like high volume users, about 1 in 7 of our respondents said they drive more than 50 miles a day. At least they did on whatever an average pre-COVID weekday would have been. So a lot of miles traveled here by our respondents. But kind of a little more on the kind of glass half full look. So one thing that was we were able to do in our survey that we kind of don't get in lots of other transportation data sets, like say U.S. Census Bureau data on transportation, is a lot of other data sets, they only ask people what they do the most. And so we asked, what are kind of all the things that you do, whether you do it a lot or whether you do it a little. And so we had this 89% number here of people who drive a car an average week. And so what else do they do in an average week? And so when we look at those numbers, so a lot of people also ride in cars of various sorts. So 32% ride as passengers in cars. 14% said they used a ride-hailing type service, so Uber, Lyft kinds of services. But we also had 13% of people said they rode transit in an average week, at least once at least somewhere. And 7% said they rode a bicycle to some destination, whether it was to work or somewhere else, at least once during an average week. And so again, comparing that to data that only looks at what people do the most often, and a lot of data like the census, which looks at work trips, those numbers look a lot lower. So I think the survey here illuminated a little bit more use of alternatives than we might get from other data sets. So that's kind of the picture of where we're at now. But of course, and things that lots of policymakers and people like Shiloh are working on is trying to up those numbers. So one thing that we thought was important was if we're looking at trying to encourage different behaviors, what makes people tick? And so there was a lot of interesting behavioral questions that we asked. And so one of the first ones we asked here was kind of generally, what we asked about 8 different kinds of general ideas here about whether things were important or not important when people chose what mode of transportation to use. And so these 5 here were ones that a supermajority of respondents viewed as important or very important. So these were kinds of the more critical reasons that people are looking for when choosing how to get around. And so number 1 there was speed. So 82% said that was important or very important. And then safety also appeared quite high. And we've got 2 different kinds of safety here. We've got safety from crime, so security issues, as well as safety from traffic-related risks and crashes. So both of those popped up pretty high on there, as well as things here related to convenience. So modes being easy, and also modes being enjoyable or non-stressful, also rated highly. Kind of on the lower end at sub 50% rating as important or very important. We've got concern for the environment at 48. And then one thing that we thought was kind of interesting was financial cost, also rated kind of low on our survey here at 45%. And then desire for physical activity or exercise down there at 34. So now, as Shiloh mentioned earlier, there were lots of interesting differences when we started splicing the data by different groups. And so one was sort of by gender. And so this looks at 4 of the factors here that had sort of the biggest sort of difference in opinions by men versus women. And so we can see there's some decent gaps here. And so in particular, by double digits, women were a little more concerned than men here in terms of concern for the environment, as well as safety from crime. Now the safety one that was still pretty popular among both men and women, but for concern for the environment, we have a majority on one and not a majority um, uh, uh, on the other side. So definitely some differences here. And it actually turned out, so for all 8 of the factors that we looked at, women said that each of them were more important than men did. So I know, Shiloh, kind of your reactions to kind of when you saw that those numbers for the first time.
Yeah, we were trying to figure out what does that mean that women feel more strongly about all of the factors, and we can't necessarily discern the answer to that question from the data, but it's just interesting to note that women feel more strongly about all of them.
Yes, yeah, and yeah, I think it maybe sort of points to a little bit about maybe some kind of different messaging, perhaps in the future. Um, and that was something that I think was sort of a bit of a recurring theme is we have the data that looks at the first set of data I showed was the how everybody in aggregate felt. But there was, range in people's opinions too. And so perhaps, we can't act, the same way when communicating to every group. So we saw the split here with gender, being that we hired a pollster that also does work politically. One of their kind of standard banking questions is also kind of interesting, where they asked who they voted for in previous elections. And so I thought that was interesting, sort of from thinking about building political coalitions in the future. And so one thing that we did see as well, this was now this was pre the last election in November. So we have data here on how people voted in 2016. And so there were some variances here between Trump 16 and Clinton 16 voters. And so we looked at the Clinton voters. Perhaps things like concern for the environment popping up a little higher may not be terribly surprising. But also here we've got the Clinton voters indicating they would be more amenable to sort of arguments of a mode being enjoyable or less stressful, although it was rated pretty important on both sides. And then the Trump voters were slightly found safety from crime being more important when picking a mode than the Clinton voters did. Although, again, that was both pretty high on there for both sides as well. So some interesting political differences, and we'll see a couple more examples of that as we go along here. So this data here was on the kind of overall, like when you picking any mode of transportation. We also asked questions about specific modes of transportation, and so we asked questions about cars and driving. And so from a kind of a challenging side here, when thinking about kind of mode shift over time, there's some questions here that where people indicated to a sort of an extremely high degree that they felt cars were necessary for various things. So by an 84 percentage point margin, respondents said they think they need a car to do the things they like or need to do. So by plus 84 here, was like 90 to 6 on that question. By 81 points, people thought they need a car to carry shopping, cargo, or other people. And then by 54% margin, so another kind of pretty huge number here, people said they enjoy driving cars. So as kind of painful, sometimes people refer to kind of the situation of driving places. By 54-point margin, people said that they enjoy driving. So kind of going back to the sort of this glass half full, glass half empty idea. These are signs that changing behavior might be quite challenging. But on the flip side, people were also answered that they were concerned about various aspects of driving. And so people here by 25 point margin said they drive a car more than they would like to drive a car. And by 36% margin, people thought that spending too much time in their car wasn't great for their health. Now, is this plus 80? No, but if anybody won an election by 25 points or 36 points, that would still be pretty much a landslide. So some strong pro-car opinions and some strong, well, we're not happy about everything kinds of opinions either. So again, now these are the total numbers. And so again, we also found some interesting things when we spliced this up. So I know, Shiloh, you point to a lot of this data when we go out in the community and talk about this data set here. But I'll just show as an example here the do you drive a car more than you would like to drive a car numbers here. And we can see some quite big differences here.
Yeah, this is where the data gets really interesting because the spread between women and men gets quite significant. And on both questions, I drive a car more than I would like to, and then on this just general question of like, do you like driving? And when we start to look at how men feel about that question versus women, it becomes pretty clear that men enjoy driving their cars more than women do. And what I find really interesting to ponder is, what would our transportation system have looked like if it were women that had been designing or had been in charge of coming up with the transportation mode? What this data doesn't say necessarily is that women would have designed a system that is friendly to the bicycle. All it tells us is that women don't really like driving as much as men do. So yeah, it's interesting to say, like, who are we designing this transportation system for if it's women that really don't enjoy the dominant mode of transportation that we're all forced into?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, again, these are some pretty high numbers here, particularly for Hispanic women and Asian women. So plus 41, basically indicating that they would prefer to drive less than they do today. And I think it's also kind of a great point about this idea, like, who do we design kind of our transportation system for? But I think another kind of signal on that was a question we asked about car affordability. Now, most of the respondents said, it was just fine that they were able to afford car ownership. But if we are thinking about kind of planning for everybody and the transportation needs of kind of everybody in society, 20%, so 1 in 5 of our respondents said that they found car ownership to be unaffordable. And so, we are in Silicon Valley where, people are inventing kind of the next, $100,000 automobile. And while that might be a solution for some, there are definitely, going to be segments of the population where car ownership is unaffordable. And there's kind of lots of, data that's coming out about how people are getting car loans for like 7 years. So, how affordable car ownership, I think, is something that is a little bit worrisome here over time. And then when we splice the data here as well, so it was 20% overall. Certain groups, we're noticing kind of more affordability issues here than others. So again, women was more 1 in 4. Hispanic respondents, again, was 1 in 4. Hispanic women, 1 in 3, as with younger adults. So our youngest age group here in the survey, 32% of them found car ownership unaffordable, as did those who don't have a college degree. That was quite a bit higher there, at 27%. Now, for male college graduates, it was 8%. So 92% of them said car ownership was affordable. But again, if we're basing kind of our transportation ideas on we just need to buy the right car, you are speaking to some groups and not so much to others. All right, so that was some of the data here we had on cars. Now, so getting into the stuff here that's kind of near and dear to Shiloh. We have, of course, asked several questions here about cycling and cycling behaviors and cycling related attitudes. So one thing, again, kind of to reiterate a point we brought up earlier, is the survey indicated a bit more cycling than we see when we look at kind of other numbers. So again, census data looks at work trips, and it looks at the mode of transportation that people use for the longest distance of a trip to work. And so in Santa Clara County, that number is 2.4%. But that doesn't count people who maybe drive to work but bike to a store or bike to a friend's house. It doesn't count people who like bike to a train station and then ride a train for 10 miles. That shows up as a transit trip and not a bike trip. So we asked whether anybody rides a bike to any destination, and that's where we got the 7% number, or 6.7% here from earlier. And then we also, to kind of get an indication of kind of the universe of cyclists out there, we also asked if people ride a bike for exercise or recreation and not necessarily to go anywhere. And that came up here at 8.5%. So there are more cyclists out there than kind of the more commonly cited census data would indicate. We also saw get interesting things when we start splicing the data. And so I'll come back here to the kind of the partisanship line here, as there are definitely stereotypes out there about who bikes and who doesn't bike and who should be in favor of biking and who should be opposed to biking. But one thing that I found really interesting here was that pretty much no matter who people voted for, people biked at the same rates. So 13% of Trump voters in 2016, 13% of Clinton voters in 2016 indicated they bike for any reason. So either for travel or for recreation. A little bit of differences here in the purpose. So the Clinton voters voted a little more for travel. The Trump voters voted a little more for recreation. But at the end of the day, they both kind of rounded here to 13%. So I think that broke a little bit of, I think maybe some of my preconceptions of what that might have been before we got started. All right, some other kind of interesting things that popped up. So I know, Shiloh, since you work all across Silicon Valley and in different communities, we noticed some really interesting things here related to kind of geographic location within the county. And so this map here, we kind of roughly broke up the county into 5 areas. So kind of north, south, the foothills to the west, and either downtown or non-downtown San Jose. And so these numbers here asked, do people ride for exercise or recreation? And so there's some slight differences by area here, but they're all kind of in here in the either kind of high single digits into low double digits, kind of anywhere in the county. But when we switch the question here to do you ride for travel, we noticed quite a big difference here by area. And so downtown San Jose, the northern counties in Santa Clara County were in double digits, but then they really fell off elsewhere, particularly in the south and the west and kind of the more suburban parts of San Jose. And so I think this sort of highlights kind of that land use matters here, and the ability to go places and have places that are close to you within biking distance. And in fact, we asked that, do you feel that there are places that are close enough to you to reach by bicycle? And only the people who lived in downtown San Jose responded affirmatively to that question. And that was sort of in the negative everywhere else. So I know, Shiloh, you had some thoughts about what you thought that meant about, how we think about land use or how we might potentially kind of address this perception.
Yeah, and I think you summed it up really nicely. Land use matters. I mean, I come from the bike advocacy world, and prior to that, working on land use and housing and building our cities in a way that um, they're affordable and great communities to live in. And what this data shows us is that it is really, if we're trying to build a transportation system or a transportation ecosystem where uh, the system is resilient, it's affordable, it's accessible, it's environmentally sustainable, it's healthy. Land use matters. We have to build more densely, and you can see that again in the downtown area. People are writing for transportation because we're building the city, we're building those areas in a way that everything's kind of within a 15-minute walk or bike ride. But once you get to areas like Gilroy, it's not that feasible for people to ride their bike to the grocery store. You got to get in your car, and that is because we built it that way. So yeah, as you said, land use matters.
Yeah, definitely. It's sort of in the one of the things like when I teach transportation class is one of the first points I make either the first or second day is people get interested in transportation for lots of reasons, but you have to sort of expand your horizon beyond like, hey, I'm into trains or I'm into bikes or I'm into cars, because all these other decisions we make as a society, in particular our land use decisions, really make a difference here. In sort of behavior. We were able to kind of see some evidence of that here in our data.
And Kevin,
And
oh, I was gonna comment on this question we asked. Many of the places I need to go are close enough to reach by bicycle. That's important too, because and it speaks to our programmatic work, doing things like Viva Calle, Open Streets programs, Bike to Work Day. Because for a lot of folks, they do have in their head this notion that many of the places I need to go are too far. And that may actually be true. It may be too far. But in many cases, once you get someone to try it through Bike to Work Day or through Viva Calle, you'll see a big fat smile on their face and they'll say, oh my gosh, I just rode 6 miles and it was easy. So, this data is really interesting for us because it might be true that it is too far to ride, but there are some cases where programmatically, when we get folks to just try riding a bike, they discover, oh, it's actually not too far. So it speaks to the importance of those kinds of programs where we're encouraging people to try it and then hopefully lead to lasting behavior change.
yeah, that's a great point here on kind of behavior and based on experience, because we also, of course, found some interesting data here on how past experience, particularly childhood experience, mattered. And so we had here questions about whether people rode as a kid. And so when people rode as a kid, they're more likely to ride as an adult, particularly the more they rode as kids. So if they rode as both a preteen and continued as a teenager, they were more likely to ride a bike. And something that's a little bit here on glass half empty side. For whatever reason, our respondents who grew up in California and had their childhoods in California were much less likely to bike today than people born anywhere else in our data set. So people born in another country rode at 11%. People who grew elsewhere in the U.S. 6%. So California, you think's got advantages here in terms of weather and topography in large parts of Santa Clara County. So the kind of riding environment here for kids, that's maybe not as great as we'd like it to be. All right, so thinking about kind of what we could potentially do here again to kind of increase modes of use of alternative modes. We also asked questions here kind of related to kind of the contention for space that we have on our streets. And so one thing I know kind of in the bike advocacy world, we talk a lot about kind of additional facilities for bikes. But one thing we found is that people also want more room for cars. So we had here by plus 21, people wanted more lanes for cars, and by 41 points, more space for parking. Although one thing, perhaps again, kind of on this glass half empty, glass half full side, at least people didn't think roads are too fast or too slow currently. So by 9 points, people disagreed that we need basically higher speed limits in cities.
Yeah, and I would add here that, one of the reasons this is such an important piece of the data is we're always trying to figure out, okay, what are the public policy changes that the public is willing to endure? And so you can see here when we said, hey, do you need more lanes for cars? We're like, oh yeah, we need more lanes for cars. And I said, well, how do you feel about parking? Can we take away some of your parking? And like, don't touch my parking. I need all my parking. But when we asked about speeds on the streets, people said, yeah, I'm open to slowing people down. And this is important to note because it speaks to our Vision Zero work. Vision Zero is the worldwide initiative to reduce to zero the number of deaths and major injuries on our roadways of all roadway users, cars, pedestrians, bicyclists. And we know that speed kills. 40,000 people die on our roads every year. And speed is one of the top factors for why that happens. And so one of the most important ways that we can make our streets more safe is to simply slow people down. And when we asked people, are you okay with being slowed down? They essentially said, yeah, I'm okay with that. And this is also really important in terms of our ability to advocate for bikes, because one of the top reasons people cite for not wanting to get on a bike is that they don't feel safe. They feel like they might get run over by a car. So what this data shows us is that people are willing to slow down and therefore make the roads more safe.
All right, so switching gears a little bit here. So, of course, we did our survey back in March of 2020, in the beginning of March of 2020. So lots of things, of course, have happened since then. So we did want to spend some time talking about transportation here during the COVID era and what might happen here in the post-COVID era. So just kind of a little bit data here on recent history. We look here at what happened to the transportation system during the last year. And so I'm sure we all recall kind of the empty streets we saw back in last March and last April. And driving did decrease here. This is state data here by almost 2/3 by early April. But we can see here that traffic volumes have rebounded despite many people working from home. It looks like here statewide driving has been only about 10% here since last summer. And back in November, we had a day where we pretty much almost went back to kind of pre-COVID driving levels, which might be a little concerning if you're thinking about all the driving that isn't being done to work that might reappear later. Here in Santa Clara County, the numbers show a little bit more of a drop. So similarly, the peak drop was about 2/3 back in April. And since the summer, Santa Clara County has been more of here in a kind of a plateau here at about 30% less driving. So that is indicating perhaps a little more work from home, which I think most people would probably assume here about Silicon Valley. We also look at what that has meant. So I know we talked a little bit about traffic safety a little bit earlier, and traffic volumes. This is nationwide data here. In the first half of 2020, they dropped by 17% compared to the first half of 2019. But decreases traffic volume, kind of as Shiloh was indicating earlier, the impact of speed and speed tending to be more dangerous. The deaths per mile traveled, so the death rate of our transportation system increased by 20%. So that is, we saw less driving, but we also saw kind of more dangerous roads. And so that's definitely sort of a concerning point here. So I think that, so we saw the numbers here for what happened in the last year, but the big question everybody's asking is what's going to happen next? And so will some of the changes that we have seen over the last year, how will that change in the hopefully soon post-COVID future? So one way that I like to think about this is one kind of term we use sort of in transportation theory is that transportation is what we call here a so-called derived demand, in that we don't travel just for the sake of traveling. Usually, how we travel is a function of other things that happen. And so we talked a little bit about that with land use earlier. And so I think one way we can think about how likely or not likely some of these changes will stick is how have underlying factors changed. And so there, of course, there was the session earlier in the conference kind of on commercial real estate. And so how people work and the decisions of businesses will matter a lot in terms of what happens next. Will companies let their workers keep working from home? Do workers like working from home? Will companies bring them back? And so I think that's a huge question here moving forward. Now we do have some recent evidence where companies have tried work from home in the past, not forced in the same way, of course, as the last year. This kind of escapes me. Shiloh, do you recall there was one of the big companies here in Silicon Valley? They brought their workers back who were telecommuting maybe the last couple of years.
Yeah, I thought that was Yahoo when Marissa came into her role.
Right. Yeah. And so that was a situation where people were working from home, at least in some numbers, and then they did them in less numbers. So will we see kind of a Meyer era kind of Yahoo coming up here, or will companies think differently? Will workers demand to work at home more? So that will be something that will definitely affect here what happens with the transportation system. Here is this was a survey done out of Arizona State and the University of Illinois Chicago, and it asked people, "Hey, do you think you are going to work at home after the pandemic?" And people definitely thought they would work from home more often. So that red never box does shrink. So people do think they'll be working at home some. Now, up at the top, there's a gray box there for working from home every day. And while that grows, it grows from maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7% to maybe like 9 or 10%. So there's people who think they'll be working home forever, but most people don't. So we might see some decreases in frequency of travel to work. But I don't necessarily think, at least the public at large, I don't think thinks that they'll be working from home permanently, kind of on an everyday basis. Going back to this derived demand question again here, when we think about how things changed, another one that I think there's been kind of a lot of discussion about is whether people's residential choices and where people want to live have changed because of the pandemic. And there has been evidence of kind of increased rates of moving over the last year. But again, will those changes stick? And so a couple interesting survey results here. This was a Pew Research Center survey back from last summer about who moved for pandemic-related reasons. And 3% of adults at that early point of the COVID era said they had moved, but it was really driven by young people. So people under 30 had higher rates of moving. And then when they asked about their moves, 61% said they moved in with family, and 41% said they moved in with their parents or their in-laws. So, Shiloh, I don't know what your reaction would be to that, but if you got people under 30 moving in with their parents, does that seem all that sticky?
No.
Yeah. So that was so definitely. I am not so sure about the changes here to residential choice. And you look at some of the real estate numbers. Santa Clara County, there was some state data that showed prices went up by 15% by a much higher rate than elsewhere in the country in the last year. So I'm not so bullish on the idea that we've had long-term changes in residential choices. So kind of as we get close to wrapping things up here. So Shiloh, I had a question for you. What are you most curious about as we move into the post-COVID era, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I'm most curious about something you were touching on those last few slides, and that is how sticky the behavior is going to be. What specifically have we learned about ourselves that we're going to retain in terms of, wow, I really, for example, in the beginning of the pandemic, I heard a lot of people commenting on how quiet and peaceful their streets were without people driving. And they were just having a different experience of the street because they weren't loaded with cars, and it was just much more enjoyable. So are people going to remember that and say, you know what, I like that, and I want to retain that, and I want to build my community so that the streets are much more enjoyable? The other thing that I'm curious about is, and it's kind of the same thing, is we have learned a bunch of things about ourselves. We have learned, one of those things is we changed our behavior real quick when we were asked to. We stopped driving. You saw that in the numbers. So we are capable of it. We are capable of changing very rapidly. And so if you combine that with this, what we've learned about what our transportation system should look like, what should the ideal transportation ecosystem look like in the future? Bikes, public transit, walking, 15-minute communities, and potentially shared TNCs or automated vehicles. Is that what our system should look like? Probably. And so if that's the case, what are we doing now to move us towards that, instead of what I hear people talking about, which is, what's it going to look like? What will our transportation system be? Let's not ask that question. Let's ask, what do we want it to be and how do we build it? So that would be my answer to the question, but I'm curious, what do you think?
Well, I think that was a great way to put it. So there is this question about what's it going to be as if we have no hand in changing it. So I think, if I was to think, like, what am I most curious about is to see kind of the changes in how we'll demand things now that we've experienced different things. So we've now been kind of exposed to different ways of doing things that people may have wanted to try, but it's sort of hard to break inertia. Now that we've had to try them, will we change, kind of how we advocate for things? I think kind of on that note too is kind of the COVID era has changed how we interact and advocate for things in terms of like participating in public meetings and reaching out and kind of making our voices heard as citizens. And will changing that up from, say, the traditional town hall meeting at 7 p.m. That's accessible to some, but not everybody. Might there be kind of other ways that society has changed that will help make those changes possible? But I would definitely agree with your point that we've got a little more control into perhaps what transportation might look like than just sort of being like waiting to see what happens.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our time. Kevin, thank you so much. This was great. And thanks to everybody out there watching, and enjoy the rest of the conference.